realize I realize the third row was telling me that I should find a way to integrate that 12 factors into this talk. And I was sat there thinking, I might be able to do it if the keynote finishes on time. And then it finished, actually I don't know what time it finished, but I left about 5 minutes before. So, familiar with 12-factor applications, then you should know more than me. I'm thinking, oh, what if they know more than me? They might be asking the difficult questions. 12-factor applications, there is a website that talks all about the 12-factor applications. It's 12factor.net. How many people have heard of a 3-factor application? No one? Oh, wow. I found out last week there's actually a 3factor.net which talks about 3-factor applications, because, you know, what's better than 12 factors? It's 3. At some point we'll get down to 1-factor applications. That 3-factor application says use event source and GraphQL and all the world will be good. So it's not really related to this one. I just find it amusing that this is kind of so taken off in people's mind that somebody who's pushing CQRS and GraphQL has decided, I know, I'm going to come up with 9 better. It's the 3-factor application. So the reason, if you look at how application architectures have evolved over the years, people are looking for how to make application development agile. They've been adopting DevOps to enable the orchestration of the deployment. How's the best to write applications so they can work and run effectively in the cloud. So if we think about what is a 12-factor application, the 12-factor application is not 12 factors of how you write your software code. It is not 12 ways of deploying the code. It is a methodology. It is how you write your application. It is how you deploy your application. It goes across the entire life cycle. And that's reflected in the rather disparate different factor applications. So if I think about the code that I'm writing, I quite often will just take for granted, or at least I hope we're all taking for granted, that we're going to put it in the code repository. Necessarily think that that is a critical part of your application development practice. Although if you read the daily WTF, you'll find many people don't seem to take for granted the fact that the source code goes into a version control system. It talks about how you define your application, how the software should be constructed, how it should be built, how you should deploy it into production. Very little of this is about the nuts and bolts and software. I think whenever I read through it, the one that always gives me the biggest pause is the processes item, and I'll get to that in detail. So, hands up here who isn't using a Git. So what do you use? I'm just curious. You use Git. I said it's. Oh. Okay, that's interesting. So I'm not using version control. Good. In kind of traditional software projects that I've worked on historically, we have distributed the source code across lots and lots repositories. And 12-factor application says that this is an anti-pattern, and that for a single application, all of its source code checked into a single repository. That means that when you're building it, when you're building build and release pipeline, you have one repository to trigger from and not multiple. I actually have to admit, Oh, I've gone back to the beginning. Sorry. Yep. Um, thank you. Um, I know I break this factor on a daily basis with one of the websites I run, but the fact that I break this, I would claim that I'm not running a microservice, I'm not writing an app, but I did it again. Um, I'm not sure that's me. I don't. Oh, I hope not. A timer that goes back to slide number 1. Yeah, if it was a night succession, the horror would be over in 5 minutes. Um, so if you ever find yourself thinking, well, I want to share code between multiple applications, the 12-factor application design says you don't put that into another repository and pull. Your build doesn't pull from 2 repositories. What you do is you take that code that you want to share between multiple applications, you put it in its own repository, you build it, and that into a dependency management system like Maven. And then that comes up to the next one, which is about dependencies. So you don't have to have, if your application is building on a open source framework like MicroProfile, there's not an expectation that you put all of the source code for MicroProfile into your repository to build it. What you should do is you should be encoding those dependencies even Gradle. So when your build process runs, it's composing an application and pulling in the dependencies from there. But what's key in this factor is you don't want to have an assumption that when you deploy into production, you're going to run on this version of this software. So 12-factor applications would advise against the traditional practice in Java EE worlds of my build produces a WAR file. I hand my WAR file over to the operations team, and the operations team then go and deploy it into web or Wildfly or what the server is, and I'm going to make the assumption that I've tested it against this version of runtime and it will just run. Encode your dependency in your application and use bundling, including. That's why you get some people turning around and say make jars not wars, but it's not. You don't have to go to that extreme. Have to be okay. Everything has to be a jar. It just says your application should be whole. It should be a single deployable, whatever that is. 12-factor also says do not ever. Your configuration should be separated out and provided in the environment at the point you deploy the application. This is actually really important. Many people have read online about people who've checked in Git repository, and all of a sudden, I can see this happens with people's Amazon API keys with a scary regularity that somebody has accidentally checked it in. And I wish to say that my development team has never done this, but my development team has done this deliberately. It was by accident. They didn't intend to. But and in fact, if you read this one in detail, the website says the litmus test for whether you've got this right or not is whether or not you have any credentials encoded in your application. If you have none in your application, you've probably got this one right. What is configuration? Well, configuration is things that you want to vary on a deployment by deployment basis. It is not necessarily, configuration isn't a special number that base to work something out. That's not configuration. That's fine to be in downstream dependencies. What port number are you going to be running? Where is your database? What credentials should you be logging into the database? That's what configuration is. It's interesting when it's a slide. If I hit it skips forward. no idea what's going on. Maybe I need to reinstall PowerPoint. So the next in a backing service and attached resources. So again, you don't want to hard code a dependency on your to be able to configure that in the environment as a URL or as a description that tells your application service is, and that talks about backing service in development versus in testing versus in production. You don't want, I know some people who think, oh, I'll just rebuild from source and I'll combine everything with slightly different configuration. And that's really not what you're supposed to be doing. Actor says that you should have 3 different phases of your application. You have the where you take the source code, you combine it with the dependencies, and you that needs to be combined with the configuration that will then be deployed during the process. Each of your releases is unique. If you need to change the configuration, you rerun your release. You create a new release, a new identifier. You don't. If you bug, you to as simple as possible that you do not need to touch. Traditionally, and if you go in it up and running again, that 12 factor says if you need to make something, build or release phase, and then rerun. What that does mean is your build and your release phase needs to be as quick as possible. Take an outage in your run phase and you're going back to fix it your release phase. You don't want that to take 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Kind of something you avoid. So the 12th factor says you should run everything as a stateless process. Now, if anyone here knows anything about Java, you know that Java generally scales out by using multiple threads. So you have a JVM workload, you just add more threads, more work, and your process gets larger. In 12 factor, it does actually recognize that Java does this, but it advises against essentially doing more load by throw more capacity at a process. Your Java runtime is a single, which is what Node does, and then every single to do that. But it says you should design your application so when you need more to process more requests, instead of trying to add more threads and use more compute capacity, just start a new instance of the runtime and start workload balancing across 2 of them. Don't rely on things in the file system. Don't rely on things that are or instances or HTTP sessions that are stored in memory, because if you processes goes away, you've just lost all of the session important information for your client of your service. So you shouldn't be doing that. There should, damn it. Every process should be stateless. If you use the file system for temporary storage, don't use the file system to be. So, I mean, is uploading a big file for you to, and you're going to do some processing and hand it back, or even a small file, fine to store it temporarily on the file system. Because the subsequent elsewhere. When you're exporting services, you should service using a port. If you're an HTTP server for just set the port number, and then the port number will define it. And that you use for HTTP will allow you the ports. You shouldn't coded port numbers in your code. That should be outside of it. Now, via code, of course, if you're deploying into a Docker container, you can actually define it in code, because when you deploy the Docker container, you do a mapping from the inside port, and it's actually the outside port that's so in an environment like that, you actually change where the configuration for the code, and it's not a problem. But you have to know at that point is probably your Docker container, a jar file. And this is one of the reasons about jar files, because if you're using a Docker container, your single deployment artifact that contains all of your dependencies is your Docker image. What's in your other? That a jar file in a Docker image is a bad idea. And the reason I say that is because Docker has this nice layering effect. So you can essentially layer your Docker container to minimize the deploy time when you're actually putting the outputs out. So if you're, I think if you're using Docker, you can actually hard code the port number into your application, because your deployment information, your Helm chart, your Kubernetes YAML, your Swarm equivalent, whatever it is, then define the mapping. Concurrency. Okay, I think I already. I talk about scale out. One of the reasons why I'm not doing scale, no guarantee that that new process is able to read the same part of the file system. Important in you using virtual machines. If you're spinning up a new virtual machine for your second interest, you wouldn't expect a shared file system either. Oracle Code 1 yesterday. My take on this one and her take on this one are, not 100 lines of both. make sure you want to minimize. You want it to shut down center sig. You want your application to stop accepting to complete. Now, this is a reason why in a 12-factor application you running requests. You want the request to take at most a couple of seconds, because what you don't want to do is if you to be a long run. Even though you should design your application to cope with being shut down gracefully and to and have a quiesce period, you should also cope. Because you might be being restarted completely fresh copy somewhere else, and you need to be able to cope with that. So this is another reason why you don't want to have state information heaped around in process, because you've no guarantee that you're going to be the so the next request comes in. If you're relying on the have two models, or the pet cat or your pet stick, you take kind of cow, because I'm not sure the idea of treating anything kind of not great. The bit that I find I have a bit of trouble with is whether or not this factor is supposed to add code into your service being unavailable. So assume what this is, and one of your to another service. If that other service goes away, you know, you don't want that to affect you. But I'm not quite sure from my reading of disposability whether the idea of this one is supposed to assume that your downstream service be resilient to that fact. This is kind of important because MicroProfile provides some APIs to help in certain areas, and micro fault tolerance comes in useful for disposability if it's supposed to cover that. And I'm still trying to work out if that's the intention of this one or it's actually another one. The 10th factor is you want to have development production. So traditionally in software development, when in your development machine, you aren't going to be the same backing service as you use in production. It is quite common that in development you might use an in-memory but then in production you use an in-memory database. You're going to use a database. 12 factor says don't do that. You want to be using exactly the same implementation in development as production. Go from your in-memory database to your big iron database. Your big iron database may behave differently, which means the code that you've done in development when you run in your release process may fail. If you're running in development using the same database, those issues all go away. And you know the emergence so many of the software used to get installed on a developer run. To not the real thing go away. Of course, it might be a different issue, but you know, that to one side. How many people here use Tomcat or Jetty or Wildfly or hopefully Liberty or some kind of application server? Okay. One thing that they all do, they all have in common, is they write the log files to a separate log file on disk. They have a load of logic in there which says when the file gets to a certain into a new file, and I'm going to switch to and start doing things. That's not 12-factor says out and system and don't worry about how they get aggregated. Your application should not care about that. That's a big mindset change for me when I first saw this, because I was just used to, oh, well, I'll just write some code that forwards it on to my log aggregation service without writing it to local disk, and I'll write it into my application, and I'll treat it like it's a backing service. But 12-factor says, no, just output it to standard output. One running in a lot of these cloud environments, Docker and Cloud Foundry, they all take those log files and they feed them through into the Docker, into the Kubernetes system, and an awful lot of productized Kubernetes will stand up Elasticsearch logging elk stack, and they'll actually forward all the logs to that. So your application doesn't have to deal with how do I write, how do I store the log files. The kind of system around it takes care of that. And that means your application can spend its CPU cycles not on writing files and rotating log files, but it can actually do that to a remote system. If, of course, you do write these log files, maybe you just have no choice. It says the forward of those log files shouldn't happen within your process. I'm using this as an example. If you're going to forward your log files to a remote system, you don't do that in the process that's serving your application requests. You use a separate admin process to do that. If you have to migrate your database, don't try and do it during application start. All of the kind of administrative tasks should be separate from your mainline application code. This is, you want your mainline application code to essentially have one consideration, which is I want to spend all of my time making sure that are coming into me. So, as I said at the beginning, factors here are about process. They're about not what software you write, but how you orchestrate the delivery into production of your services. So if you could look at this and think, well, there's not much MicroProfile up here. There's only a few areas where MicroProfile creeps in. But that's because most of the other things aren't concerned with how you write your code. They're concerned with how you do your software development. What is your development and delivery culture? So there are two things in MicroProfile that are particularly helpful for 12-factor applications. One is MicroProfile configuration. MicroProfile configuration allows you in your application to essentially define, and the configuration will come somewhere, but without you having to worry about where it comes from. So it's fairly normal for some people to think, I'll get all my configuration from Java system properties. Java system properties aren't very easy to set, though, in a Docker environment. It's much easier to set environment properties in a Docker world, because when you launch the Docker container, you can set environment variables. So do you write system.get or do you do system.getenv? Well, the nice thing about profile configuration is you can use a single API. It will work out and fetch the configuration from the best. You move between different deployment environments that may exist. Your application doesn't have to be recoded. If you decided today that you're going to deploy as Java minus jar, you can use system properties. If tomorrow you move to Docker, you don't have to your application. You define injection points. You can inject your configuration, and as I'm showing here, it can be overridden from multiple sources. When it comes to the resiliency, assume your downstream service may go away. Build assumptions around that it will fail at some point, and MicroProfile provides to effectively make you and I've just been told to stop. So here are a whole bunch of references. Somewhere on that's 12-factor using MicroProfile, which so a bunch of links here. More about 12factor.net. If you want to know more about MicroProfile, there is microprofile.io, but also to Open Liberty, we have a bunch of guides that take APIs. It happens to use Liberty, which is our implementation, but it focuses on the API. It doesn't focus on our implementation API. To do it with. That's the end. Thank you very much. Actually out of time even for questions. So if you do want to ask, I will be at the IBM booth. Come over. We have MicroProfile t-shirts if you want MicroProfile t-shirts too. Thank you.